Ranking villains have become one of my favorite pastime on my channel, and that is evident by the popularity they have gotten when it came to my Disney and Pixar villains rankings. And this is also something I mentioned when I talked about my DreamWorks villains and why they work, and why I think it is truly time that I start to talk about ranking them finally. A long time coming for some fans of this channel now. And before I officially begin, I thought I'd put out this warning at first to how I do rankings, where I will eventually leave out some villains considering what kind of role they play in the story and my personal interest in that very story. Something I've done for Disney and of course Pixar in that case, because there are just so many characters that can be considered to be villains but aren't really in the path of the main character as you would actually think. So I will leave out a few despite clickbaiting you into thinking every single one of them will be counted, where you will understand my point when the video goes along, which also might include combining a few to make my life a little easier. For example, this is going to exclude the bad guys and Megamind as villains even though they begin as such. They are the focus and main characters and eventual heroes of the entire story, so I cannot actually count them in that regard. I'm also not going to count Ken either because he was literally the only sane person in that mistake of a movie called the B movie, and Spirit Untamed is also a dumb movie I never saw and never want to, and does not look like it relates to the actual first one in any way as a spin-off. And keep in mind, I worked on this video before Ruby Gilman and still haven't actually watched it yet, so sorry Chelsea fans if you notice I exclude her from that, but I honorably mentioned here at the start to realize that I know she exists. And lastly, I will not focus on villains who are big monsters and cannot really speak or interact with the characters in a meaningful way so that you can understand that too. So I guess with all of those out of the way, let us begin. Turbo is in fact one of the dumbest movies ever and one of the worst that DreamWorks actually had to offer for a studio that constantly moves up and down on the quality scale. And Guy Guenay is certainly one of the most pathetic DreamWorks antagonists that was ever created for a movie that really doesn't have much to offer. And this is all made worse by the fact that he is a twist villain who is in fact the main idol of the main character as an ambitious and competitive egomaniac who would do anything to win, even if that means resorting to cheating by cutting off a snail and inadvertently making the snail lose its own speed. Everything I just said sounded stupid because it truly is. It's literally a dude trying to beat a snail to win in the last act of the very film. There is nothing remotely interesting about him because he was developed as a well-liked racer who just turned out to be a jerk to beat a snail so that he can go fast. It is something that you just don't think about when it comes to DreamWorks villains, and it really shows. So dumb, and I want to move on. The Boss Baby remains to be the biggest mistake DreamWorks ever did, and I really mean that, which affects the film's main villain also. I would rank him higher if I had better feelings regarding the Boss Baby, but I don't because this movie is part of the worst that DreamWorks has to offer. I just really don't care to talk about this movie or Francis E. Francis because it's all stupid. He was this super colossal big fat boss baby but kicked out because he was lactose intolerant, which means he couldn't stay a baby and was raised and grew old and wanted to get revenge with puppies instead to bring down the baby corp and babies as cute overall. And this is where I really want to stop talking about this because it just seems so stupid. The person who created the concept of Boss Baby should actually pay for their sins because everything about this is dreadful. I really don't have anything to say because of how draining these movies are as an experience, and I want my life energy back now. So I'll just move on because these movies and its villains are designed for dum-dums and just babies and only babies. Not one person who grows up would ever like this movie at all, and it's worse than what Illumination has to offer. Obviously, after the Boss Baby, I have to include the Boss Baby 2. This movie is actually dumber than the Boss Baby in my opinion, but I only rank the villain higher because he's played by Jeff Goldblum. It's just that I like the weirdness of Jeff Goldblum in any film despite my appreciation of Steve Buscemi as well, who played Francis in the last film, but just hate the Boss Baby as a whole. Dr. Erwin Armstrong is better in this case because at least he still teaches babies to be naughty, to actually affect them to do evil things like a villain should. And at least he's an actual baby this time from the entire runtime of the film instead of an old man who was a baby before, making it relatable to a degree, I think. Not that I think any of these films offer any relatability at all or anything else as a movie, because it still is terrible considering it is just Jeff Goldblum's voice within a character that is a baby. Like I said with the previous film, there isn't really much to add because the Boss Baby is just so stupid and should be forgotten throughout history if we are to get out of this. So let's just get on with this. This is where you understand that DreamWorks has a bad habit of making franchises out of horrible films alongside its good ones, and Trolls is no exception to this, being a painful dumb experience for me, and Trolls World Tour is an extra painful dumb experience for me. And Queen Barb is also very dumb, and I really don't want to talk about either, but I have to for the sake of villainy in this situation. She's not bad by any means like the others, but I don't think anything about this movie is remotely interesting and just a pain to sit through. One that I really don't want to watch ever again. She's just a hard rocker that has a disdain for other forms of music the other trolls have and just wants to remove her so hers is the only one. Just a dumb form of world domination through music and just being a kids movie, which I really don't like because it's all paired with these dumb trolls and dumb popular music I don't want to ever hear again. She's not really a villain in this case where she does want to unite everyone but just wants her rock music instead to unite them, which they can't because everyone has different tastes and whatnot, where you can clearly see how different a taste I have in movies that don't involve the boss baby or trolls in any way in that regard. I'm just gonna actually move on from this point now. Once again, I have to focus on Trolls and the Boss Baby, where once again I also question why DreamWorks actually thought Trolls and the Boss Baby were good franchises to continue. We notice how this entire bottom half of DreamWorks villains list just consists of them and only them, and I don't really find them interesting, where at the very least, Chef is actually the most interesting of this very type. She's just one who had it all in the beginning until the Trolls ruined her life to be banished from the Bergen town. She just got bitter because they ruined her life and wants to feed them as a result, but then again, at the end, they sing songs to actually get together and then she gets pushed out again. And I really did not want to conclude this in because I find nothing interesting about anything these movies provide at all. I'm just sorry. I just cannot for the life of me like or find these movies interesting in any way because they're just kids movies and nothing more. Just like how the Boss Baby movies are baby movies and nothing more. And trust me when I wish I could have said more, but I really couldn't with the type of movies they mainly are, and the main villain doesn't actually factor much into it, especially about a film about singing pop culture trolls that I fucking hate. Prince Charming is in fact the worst Shrek villain, and it's not even close. He's not bad like the other villains before on this list, but certainly isn't good either, coming from a unique franchise that Shrek was, where Shrek the Third literally is one of the weakest films they have ever produced. I don't hate this movie as much as many others, but I certainly get why it's bad for the franchise, and Charming is sort of one of those elements that weren't worked out considering how the other villains actually impact the story and the characters for the better. In this film, he's just a whiny baby who just wants the throne that he and his mommy wanted in the previous film, and that's it, which is fine considering he is bitter and for Shrek taking that from him, but he doesn't really impact him much due to his adventure throughout the course of the film that really didn't need to happen and does not fit the Shrek as a franchise and as a movie experience in any way. Yeah, he stages a coup successfully imprisoning the princesses, but I just don't like how he stages a musical too against the entire audience of people who don't like him at all so that he could kill Shrek, because everyone likes Shrek and not this dumbass who can't even sing very well. It's just not interesting that this is the route you decide to take, and that is more of an unimportant side story because Shrek didn't want to become king, or people like Charming actually wants to be king instead, proving how stupid he was. I mean, yes, I like it at times, especially when I was a child, but everything about him and the movie just doesn't actually impact it in a meaningful way like his mother or even Farquaad did actually much better. Like all the other Shrek villains actually have something more interesting to offer to affect Shrek throughout the film, and nothing about this film was remotely interesting or impactful at all, and neither was Charming to any degree. Shark Tale is a weird movie where the hero is more unlikable than the villain itself. Which of course, I really mean that because he's not worthy of being anything close to a hero, and I really see that on why the movie isn't very good either. And in the case of Don Lino, he's not actually very good either as a villain. I mean, I don't find him particularly a bad villain per se, but just not a good one despite being played by Robert De Niro, where for some reason this entire movie wanted to be a mafia type movie considering Martin Scorsese is also in this film too. I mean, I really don't understand how either De Niro or Scorsese got caught up in a DreamWorks film known as Shark Tale. It makes no sense whatsoever like his entire villain arc, because you know they are sharks and they eat fish and whatnot, where his son Lenny does not actually want to eat fish and whatnot, and then his other son dies by accident, vowing vengeance against the shark slayer, discovering he was working with his son Lenny and chasing him down until he gets caught and realizing that all of this is a misunderstanding and the characters reconcile. It's just not that very interesting, man. Everything that was built up in this group of mafia sharks that eat fish for the sake of it because you know that's the way they're designed to do in life, where it's somehow all done away because of the relationship that Lenny and Oscar have, that they say they're all now cool now. Which is stupid because this guy is a criminal to fish kind, and we shouldn't have this ending because it doesn't make any sense at all, just like this film's Oscar nomination for Best Animated Film. It's just amazingly stupid in my opinion, and I don't know why they thought making this movie was such a good idea. I mean, the movie and Don Lino are at least more interesting than the others before this, so I'll give it that, but definitely not the lackluster ending that destroys the purpose that they were built for in the entire film. Smek is somehow the main antagonist of the film Home, where he really doesn't actually have much to offer in any way. I only counted him here because he served as the overall main antagonist of the Home franchise, which I really didn't even know they actually had one other than this very movie. I just put him up higher on this list because I feel indifferent to him and not as bad as the other DreamWorks villains before this point, which I pain because those movies are a pain to sit through, wanting to take over the Earth with a bunch of other species of cowards, and one that is played by Steve Martin, which I thought was neat. But yeah, they really don't do much for his character as a main villain other than this point at the beginning. He's got the basic tendencies and all about what he wants, but nothing else unfortunately that I found interesting. And they actually forget about his character from being that main threat at the end, becoming a DJ, and that's virtually it. Galaxar is a shallow, one-dimensional villain in my opinion in a semi-okay movie like Monsters vs. Aliens. I mean, don't get me wrong, I have my fun moments with the movie and its cast, just like how Dwight Schrute is playing Galaxar himself, but there really isn't much to offer despite the zany attitude the movie has with the Monsters vs. Alien aspect. They had some little insight to his backstory and how his home planet was destroyed because of him, but they really don't do much with that and just have him be the standard typical invade your planet alien villain and kill everyone and so on, so that I can populate it instead. It's just done in a comedic style and it's just very generic in my opinion, and nothing more than having a personality to go along with it. He is portrayed as ruthless and oppressive and totalitarian dictator, but is also shown as incompetent when it comes to planning everything out. Like, he really doesn't know how to do things that should work to his advantage, like communicating with his own clones and of course to the humans of what he wants, and it shows. It's just stupid how ridiculously genocidal he is, as he murdered his own species for seemingly petty reasons about his wife and having children. Just a typical alien villain for a standard kids movie that was geared more to be that and nothing more. So I guess this falls in the category of fun bad probably. Not particularly great in any way, but still dig it for what performance was delivered overall. Humpty Dumpty is somewhat the main villain of the first Puss in Boots film. I say that because he is Puss's adopted brother, and the main ones are actually Jack and Jill, but don't really matter as much as what Humpty did and the work when Humpty is revealed to betray Puss, considering they've all worked together. And Humpty is certainly interesting for being friends with Puss until he starts to get hailed as a hero, carrying the stigma of being the thief instead, spending less time with him, which of course can only make him grow more embittered as what happened when Puss was tricked into committing a robbery in his hometown, which of course contributes to the realization that he abandoned Humpty and set forth in motion his revenge when he orchestrated everything to get him imprisoned. And in the end, everyone has his change of heart because the Great Terror would destroy the town due to the Golden Goose being its gosling. It's more of trying to make amends with their past since they were brothers, and he realizes this and his mistakes, which makes his sacrifice well rewarded to save the town and revealing his heart of gold underneath by becoming a golden egg. It's not well done like everything else because the movie is particularly not memorable in any way, but something at the very least that gets some enjoyment out of it. Just very standard in all aspects of it, and Humpty is very standard in that case too. Not necessarily a great villain either, but something that had an emotional connection that is to be given. Makunga at first glance would be obviously DreamWorks' parody of Scar from The Lion King, that he wants power and to be a usurper, and that's basically it. He's just one who wants to be the alpha lion without killing anybody, because these movies are really about that and its wacky comedic nature of animals in Madagascar and Africa and so on. Just a cocky lion who wants to rule over the other animals, which he does for a time due to his manipulative tactics, but fails considering his leadership provides absolutely nothing, which is also like Scar also, meaning he actually is more like Scar. Actually thinking about it, I take it back. His motivations and leadership are actually very similar to Scar without being blood related or having dark villainous tendencies, being a pompous ass instead. Because everyone starts to hate him over time, and Alex and the others deliver the water bag, which actually delivers his defeat when he's actually tricked into holding Nana's purse. The other major antagonist of the Madagascar franchise from the first, who really came into her own in this movie and actually defeats the main villain of this one, ironically by spanking him and calling him a bad kitty. Just a funny defeat to an otherwise mediocre Scar. If I'm being fairly honest, I'm not a huge fan of Ants at all for being DreamWorks' first movie, especially the fact they released it in the same year and timeframe as Bugs Life with DreamWorks. Something of course I have to complain due to Jeffrey Katzenberg, whom I intently dislike. But compared to other Bugs movies, at least this focuses on having a villain within the same species, considering the movie is about ants, and not a very good one in my opinion. It's just interesting to note that General Mandible was played by the one and only Gene Hackman, who played Lex Luthor in the Superman films. Amini certainly is a very threatening villain, being a warmonger who doesn't care about his colony as a whole, and just a power-hungry xenophobic monster. But of course, the movie just doesn't really deliver anything great for me, being a jumbled mess in most instances, affecting everything in that aspect. Because I know where they wanted to go for being the arrogant leader who doesn't value those below him in his own society like many dictators, but just falls flat for what everything is in the movie. I just put him higher than the others because at least I appreciate the merit of what it tried to accomplish, even when said things were executed very poorly in my opinion. Just one of those villains I have no real interest overall compared to the others. So now this is where we start to get more interesting in villains in my opinion, starting out with a great underrated classic like The Road to El Dorado. This film has a lot to be enjoyed about it that makes you kind of sad that DreamWorks decided to stop doing 2D after films like Sinbad, which to be fair wasn't actually as good as this. And the villain of this film in Tezel Khan is certainly more interesting than the other previous ones on this list, but still not enough to be in high regard or my favorites in my opinion. He is a fanatical and vicious Mesoamerican priest in the city of El Dorado who has a fixation on human sacrifices, and I think this is portrayed really well within the film, being a power-hungry and sadistic for who he truly is in his society. I just really love how passionate he is about sacrificing people to the gods, where you can see his evil bleed out when he notices Miguel's cut because he knows that gods actually can't bleed, knowing that they are human and sham. He is just one of those strongly devoted to his beliefs of their gods and does whatever it takes to fulfill that aspect, especially working with Hernan Cortez after he gets banished from the city, who of course also wants to go and kill natives wherever he can, which of course is actually more worse than Tezel as a villain, but still isn't the main one in that regard. One where he believes that Cortez is the main god considering what he brings compared to Miguel and Tulio with his attitude, but of course we realize their own actions, they cause the interest to be blocked and make him look like a lying heathen and fool, and presumably defeated and sold into slavery. I think his interest as a villain relies on his sadistic attitude, willing to do anything to fulfill the age of the Jaguar, and finding that through other people like Hernan Cortez, really great tying into the grand adventure the movie brings. Not the best villain for me in any way, but certainly a more fun and devious one. Sinbad is just one of those films that was certainly interesting by its visuals in some cases, but still wasn't enough to carry the story in any interesting way, and sadly closed the book on DreamWorks doing any 2D at all, which is unfortunate. And of course also thanks to Shrek and Pixar. And Eris is certainly one of the better aspects of the movie, but not by much since he is very standard and basic in concept. I mean, you can see why I rank her higher due to her seductive nature and of course the chaos she caused with Michelle Pfeiffer's phenomenal performance as her. She is the very beautiful yet chaotic goddess from Greek mythology who certainly brings those devious aspects in the film, but not enough to actually make it more interesting or compelling within Sinbad's journey. The film really just doesn't deliver that for me in the end, and I can certainly understand that mixed reception when it came out. I mean, she certainly is very manipulative to set the events in motion for Sinbad, but also at the cost of her own defeat at the end, where she at least graciously accepts that, especially for one being a goddess of discord. Nothing actually threatening to offer to the main characters as you would normally think, but still delivered in a very compelling manner, to which I will not say what that is entailing in my opinion, where I know exactly what you are thinking about right now at this very moment. That is definitely not safe for work in any way. Now, I already touched upon Drago in my last DreamWorks video, and I don't think really much is going to change from that other than the fact I don't think he is strong as the other ones after him on this list. I mean, don't get me wrong, he's strong physically, but I don't think this movie is strong enough to deliver the important points, especially him as a character. But I do rank him higher for the brute he is and how it ties back into the human's relationship with dragons, and he plays a part of being the opposite of people like Hiccup, but not one done well enough like Grimo was to be that. So like I said before, his main goal is to conquer the world with dragons and uses that in a way that makes anyone beneath him, that everything's meant to service him rather than what we learn with Hiccup that is supposed to benefit each other. And we certainly see that these interesting ways he uses to actually tame and control them to his very will, which still contrasts a lot to how Hiccup actually befriended him, just using brute strength and intimidation and really nothing more, which is certainly very interesting, but still not enough to justify the world around him in the very story. To be honest, Drago is more of a blueprint of what they actually wanted out of their human villains against Hiccup, and it certainly did have its moments despite not relatively the best it could ever have been. When I look back at older DreamWorks movies, I tend to get more sad considering the interesting quality all of their traditional animated films had, like Spirit, where it is one of DreamWorks' most beautiful films they have ever released, and the Kernel certainly is the most interesting in a realistic aspect, being a soldier and based upon Colonel Custer from the real American Indian Wars. Like most Americans who expand the West and his real-life counterpart, he is completely prideful and bigoted towards Native Americans and strongly believes in the ideology of manifest destiny. And his one is just done in a realistic way that isn't a sadist or maniacal villain that you would normally think of and just a regular human being at the time. And it's also one that is portrayed by James Cromwell, who we all know also stars as Professor Callahan in Big Hero 6 later, which is honestly baffling how you would go from an interesting villain that is certainly far more compelling with honor and humility to his role to one who is just a twist villain who just got upset his daughter died and didn't care his pride student got killed when he decided to exact his vengeance and become the main villain of the film. Most stupidest thing I've ever seen despite my love of Big Hero 6, but I guess that was just Disney's mistake. But anyways, back to the point of the Colonel. He is certainly a complex villain that represents those at the time who were relentless to get their goals and train their horses through these strict unforgiving processes and believing in the certain goals of Americans at the time against Native Americans. And at the end, we understand that he's not really evil too, because of how Spirit helped Little Crete and how he did in turn, where you see how honorable he is, where he lets them be in his defeat because you know he's not that kind of villain you would expect, and just a man with certain goals that are understandable but not justifiable in most senses against the main characters. I think most people would be surprised to find out that Lord Farquaad is actually down here on this list compared to others, but honestly realizing this against the other Shrek villains except for Charming, he's just relatively basic. Of course, the reason he is higher up because he is a very fun petty villain that really kickstarted DreamWorks into new heights of success, and you can really see why. And just remember, just because he's 20 doesn't mean he's bad, or usually when I get to these parts, the villains tend to get much better in my opinion and I hold in high regard. He's just the perfect start for DreamWorks that we know of now, being the little ruthless ruler of Duloc who actually upholds his deals, especially with Shrek, to get fairy tale creatures off his swamp and marry Princess Fiona as a result. And John Lithgow's performance as the tiny madman really added to that, especially his iconic laugh. His character is really important to see those who only see the outside represented in this disdain of fairy tale creatures, and how Shrek kinda plays into the worst of them all, and how Fiona plays a part into growing with him and finding that love eventually that of course Farquaad didn't understand with his own definitions of perfection and whatnot, where we get to see him defeated by a dragon chomped up for good until he comes back as a ghost in that ride that Universal had for a time. All in all, he's a great start for those to come, especially the terrible ones that DreamWorks produce. Dave is certainly the best name for any villain ever, and the Penguins of Madagascar really carries that. It's a very fun, wacky adventure with a very fun and zany villain. I just love that dynamic of being the beloved octopus at the zoo who is overshadowed by the cuteness of penguins and removed as a result. And because of that, he cleverly disguised himself as a human to build this empire to rid the world of such cuteness that surpassed his own, to turn creatures like the Penguins of Madagascar into these horrifying beasts that no one actually wants. Just a fun and bitter villain who just wants to ruin other animals for the sake of it, and how they ruined his own reputation, and of course turned into a small octopus at the end in the snow globe by the end of it. Nothing really much to say other than that because there really isn't. Just very high up on the list because it's fun and his name is Dave. When I was young, I did read a lot of Captain Underpants and had a soft spot for it, especially the fact that DreamWorks actually made a film based upon it. And the film really matches the feel of the book so well that makes you actually love it if you have any connection to reading them whatsoever, especially in villains like Tippy Tinkle Trousers, also known as Professor Pee Pee Poo Poo Pants. Where this is the only thing so far that makes me enjoy fart jokes in an animated movie. A villain from the start where he became one because everyone just kept laughing at his name being Poopypants, which is understandable and justifiable to why he wants to take over everything because people just cannot respect his name. It's just one that is built around this fun notion that he can't take jokes, especially when it comes from his own name in any way. It all comes to this point where he wants to raise everyone's sense of humor, and it is something I really find hilarious in concept, especially with the Turbo Toilet 2000, how Poopypants is the most serious, unserious villain of all time, but just doesn't carry enough to actually make it great with how little time they are actually giving. So just here perfectly justified due to my emotional childhood memories. Chicken Run is a good film that somehow is technically DreamWorks despite actually being mostly Aardman because of its stop motion animation. Just basically anything DreamWorks produced stop motion is just mainly Aardman instead, but still overall good for either of them and a great experience overall with a great villain in its own in Mrs. Tweety. She's the abusive wife of Mr. Tweety and the oppressive owner of a chicken farm in northern England. She desires to gain profit from her farm, but the egg yield is shown to be constantly shrinking, prompting her instead to use chickens to make her own brand of pies. She is one that is extremely selfish, greedy, ruthless, manipulative, and a hot-tempered woman who only uses chickens to get the money, which she and her husband are very low on. She is always looking for the chance to abuse her husband and the chickens, and despite her temper, she is occasionally shown to be quite clever and intellectual. She's one that comes up with the idea of buying a pie machine to make more profit from the chickens. She's also shown to be a very malignant woman who's happy with the idea of murdering the chickens, where even her own vicious dogs are really shown to be afraid of her for the same reasons. Just everything you want in a villain against a group of chickens being the arch enemy of our hero in Ginger. Something that's certainly interesting in a film about chickens and one that gets what she deserves at their end for the abusiveness that stands out a lot more than the previous villains on the list, even Drago, dare I say. Kai the Collector is certainly the weakest villain so far in the Kung Fu Panda franchise, but I still like him to some degree in some aspect. Most of this is due to the fact he's portrayed by J.K. Simmons, who has portrayed such compelling villains in the past throughout his career, where Kai is certainly a standout on his own in some situations and what he represents in the spirit. Because all of the Kung Fu Panda villains represent power in a different aspect and of course what Kung Fu is. Kai started as a villain who is young and ambitious, but still vigor, honorable, and intrepid, fighting side by side with his best friend and comrade Oogway in defending China from enemies. He displayed great loyalty to those who close to him, caring for Oogway for days until finding what was needed to save his life. However, after learning the power of Qi, Kai's ambition began to consume him, transforming into a fearsome, destructive, obsessive, tenacious, power-hungry warmonger who decided to take Qi from others for himself. Like I said in my previous DreamWorks villains video, the Kung Fu Panda villains really represent these aspects of power to a great degree to contrast to Po, and I really liked how each one actually provided in their own unique spin to relate to that, where Kai comes from Oogway's past personally to explain, just like Tai Long did for Shifu. And I also like the use compared to the other villains of this franchise, he's a supernatural villain throughout his stealing of Kung Fu Master powers through the power of Qi, which is also far better than the power of Qi that Mulan 2020 did in any way with the definitions they were talking about. But besides that, he is certainly an interesting villain who's got a lot of that I like, but not as much as the other Kung Fu Panda villains. Pitch Black is supremely underrated amongst DreamWorks villains mainly because the film wasn't as popular when it came out, to a box office disappointment, and that's sad considering it's not really a bad film at all. It's a pretty good one that had a lot of elements to like, and I actually enjoyed his character more so than others based upon Jude Law's performance of the character. But yeah, this doesn't actually mean he's the greatest in my opinion, and I think putting him here on 15 is very justifiable considering my liking of other characters. I mean, it makes more sense since he is the boogeyman and every child actually has fears about him when it comes to nightmares, where I think he's actually designed solely on the basis of reality of the world being dark against what children has to believe which is bright when you're young. He isn't particularly evil in this case, understanding what it's like to be casted out, which is something I like in relation to Jack Frost, who also isn't recognized by most kids at first, adding another layer to his relationship to the protagonist, and his design really represents that to a perfect degree. I get why some people might not actually like it being bland or lame, but I think it really captures the spirit of what he's trying to represent like the others actually do in a certain way. Being a master manipulator, Pitch often preyed on his victims psychologically. His knowledge of people's worst fears allowed him to unnerve his enemies and enjoyed watching them squirm, leaving to their fates to their imagination through thinly veiled threats before finishing them off. Just the realm of what could happen in your mind is very compelling to me, especially with our own fears we've had as a kid and actually rushed when we had a bad nightmare. Another trait that I like is how he's defeated by his own nightmares too, because he relies on fear, how it's related to the fear of being forgotten, which this movie's messages are mainly about, which I really think is nice lesson-wise to learn compared to the guardians of figures of our own childhood who are loved and believed in, where Pitch Black is feared and forgotten, and learning to overcome that in your life to realize how loneliness actually affects you by the end. Not the greatest villains by any means, but a good one nonetheless to represent our fears as a kid as we grow up, being forgotten and learning about the world. when I was young watching Flushed Away, I had no idea how stacked the main cast was, from Hugh Jackman to Kate Winslet and especially Ian McKellen as the Toad. And during that time, I was sort of scared to how he looked and was portrayed as this menacing green toad against a city of sewer rats living in London. Just a very effective villain that actually worked for me. I also cannot believe this film was also underperformed at the box office, and the reason DreamWorks and Aardman parted ways because of that. Because I think it was a good film in my opinion. The Toad is an evil, mean, pompous, treacherous, greedy, selfish, short-tempered, easily frustrated, and aristocratic amphibian who's basically the Toad version of Ratigan in some ways from Disney's Great Mouse Detective, which is also ironic considering that film also took place in London and had rats as the main characters, where this one actually had toads to take place as the antagonist instead. It's also funny to think about how the main hero and villain is portrayed by Magneto and Wolverine from the X-Men films in that regard, which I also love learning about growing up when I actually finally understood the concept of actors and acting as a kid. His backstory is great too because he was Prince, now King Charles Toad, where the guards found him one day and actually flushed him away, where he ended up here in the sewer. And considering his upper class standing, it makes sense why he wants to get rid of the sewer of all the rodents and replace them with his tadpoles for his own society he plans and feels, which is very creative in its execution. And I really liked his defeat where he gets his tongue stuck in between the gears. Just a really great fun time with such prolific actors playing the role you at least suspect them of. Professor Marmalade is truly another fun addition to a movie that is filled with nothing but bad guys who are eventually the good guys. And I think it was good to try to introduce him as a guy who eventually reveals that he wants to become the baddest bad guy of them all. The other interesting about him is that in the books his real name is which I wanted to add considering I found it funny to include mumble garbage in this video and relating that to the characters whose name was just typing things as fast as possible. It's just an interesting twist on itself to reveal a good man at first who thinks of others and helps them out for the better, but then reveals nothing more than to be a facade to hide his true nature, that of a selfish, greedy, lying and manipulative psychopath who only cares about itself and a liar full of bad intentions. He uses the bad guys as his alibi for his getaway, where he came close to destroying Mr. Wolf's friendship with Mr. Snake and the rest of the friends after manipulating them and blaming Wolf for getting them caught, falling for his tricks, and making think that he doesn't want to be around them anymore when that's not true. Marmalade is also shown to be traitorous as he's willing to leave Mr. Snake to fall to his death, which actually makes sense since he is the one who wants to be the real bad guy against that of the bad guys, and also because he gets defeated and arrested at the end because of his manipulations and lies from a society that only tolerates good guys. And I really just rank him high because of this and the bad guys returning the fun of interesting animation for DreamWorks that really kicked off other stories like Puss in Boots to take shape, and of course subverting the trope of good guys into bad guys. Thinking back on it, I really miss watching Wallace and Gromit because I had such positive memories of the film. One where I keep forgetting the main villain too, but actually hold him in high regard. Because Victor Quartermane is a sarcastic, argumentative, arrogant, aloof, greedy, and pompous hunter who really doesn't care about hunting laws or animals at all. He just loves hunting, guns, money, and shooting rabbits and animals for the fun of it. Just a deranged freak who delights in the hunt, especially when he sees Wallace transform into a were-rabbit, where I just love how you can see he's scared at first, but you see his grin to Gromit knows what he can turn into justifying hunting a man he despises. I also like the fact he's portrayed by Ralph Fiennes, who before this played one of the greatest villains for DreamWorks ever, who we will see later on this list. I also like how this is added by the fact he's wearing a toupee to add to his pompous attitude to cover up his baldness and add more to his insanity as a character displayed over time and the adventure that Wallace goes on, being the cursed were-rabbit that he is. It also adds this interesting balance to be a funny and threatening villain, which of course happens throughout the film until his very defeat, where he is mistaken for the thing he swore to destroy. Just a fun villain with a lot of charm added to it. Chantal Dubois is certainly the best villain in the entire Madagascar franchise, which also isn't saying much considering they really didn't have a main antagonist until the second movie, where you already see how much I really don't find it particularly great in many cases, where this time they actually managed to stand out with a human threat like they did with Nana, opposing the characters throughout the entire course of the film. She's just very fun, and the style of the human characters like herself really elevates that to a higher degree as a villain. Dubois goes above the law and is utterly ruthless in her own goals. She is incredibly cruel towards animals, which goes from her mercilessly hunting them down and using their decapitated heads as trophies, always on the run throughout trying to capture the main characters without a single thought for anything else, including the law she's trying to uphold. With such amazing skills only the greatest skilled humans could ever have. It's really more than you can ask for to have a villain in a franchise that is Madagascar that surpass most of its great elements. Chantal Dubois is certainly the best villain in the entire Madagascar franchise, which also isn't saying much considering they really didn't have a main antagonist until the second movie, where you already see how much I really don't find it particularly great in many cases, where this time they actually managed to surpass most of its great elements. So now we've entered the top 10, and this is where my personal favorites actually come into view, starting out with the good old Rumpelstiltskin from Shrek Forever After. He's the type of villain I actually wanted out of something like Shrek the Third, where this film is in fact the real third Shrek after the side story that no one actually really wants to remember, and truly an upgrade from the lackluster performance that Prince Charming gave as a main villain. He's also like an upgrade on Farquaad, being a short villain who impacts Shrek in a meaningful way with the powers he has to make deals with other people. I mean, after all, his life was actually impacted by Shrek in the first film because he found Fiona at the time and ruined his plan of becoming ruler of Far Far Away. Once again, more better as a villain than charming in actually taking over the kingdom. It's all done in this way that causes Shrek to disappear within 24 hours because of his manipulative deal to get what he wants and erasing the mistakes that he actually caused. One that makes Shrek realize what he had in his life before this point with Fiona and his friends, which is great development for Shrek's character from one who is a snarky, sinister, pugnacious, and ungenerous man who would do whatever it takes to claim the throne of Far Far Away, showing no care for anybody else's life, such as removing Shrek and his kids from existence. Above all, what really matters to him the most is his pet goose Fifi, which I really love about him being the only thing he cared about. So I think actually all in all, being number 10 is really justifiable because he is that little amalgamation of all the Shrek villains combined in the perfect conclusion that is to that, despite not as good as one other, and of course the Puss in Boots villains. Grimo is another villain I've already talked about in extensive detail, and for good reasons to what he represents. Because he truly is a great definition to what a main antagonist is, being the hiccup if he actually wanted to kill the dragons instead, which he is also responsible for bringing the complete extinction of the Night Furies, the dragons that Hiccup connected with that caused the events of the movies to actually be in motion. He is essentially what Hiccup could have been if the latter actually took a darker path by killing Toothless in the first film, demonstrated by his design and how, unlike Drago, he relies on wits and manipulation to get his way, and still much like Hiccup, who wasn't physically strong either. He's literally the mentally stronger version of Drago in all aspects that represents how sometimes dragons and humans cannot coexist because of how some want power and control and something we cannot stop. These are things I've already mentioned too, so I wanted to keep this relatively brief of that impact. One where we see he is right by the end because of those consequences. Maybe not in all aspects, but still proven right by how he is as a person, being the antithesis of Hiccup in all ways. One that actually could have won overall in the entire series if it weren't for characters like Hiccup being that polar opposite. The Verminator is a classic villain that is probably one of the best in all of animation, despite having no reason to actually be considered this way considering how many other compelling villains there are before or after him. But I include him here this high like I did with Chef Skinner for Pixar because I always love these types of villains that leave a lasting impression no matter the circumstance. This is also where I include a little bit of Vincent and Gladys in that being the real main villains that impact the characters more, mainly because of how the Verminator is that bridge between them to connect them with that world to actually have any action throughout. Two sides of the animal kingdom mushed together to produce this most iconic DreamWorks villain that is certainly one of the most funniest and greatest that they have to offer. It's one that in another life, if I were willing, I would certainly rank him as number 1, but still suffices to be at this position for who he actually is. I mean, the actual funniest thing about his character is how he's voiced by Thomas Hayden Church, who the very next year after this actually starred as Sandman in Spider-Man 3, portraying such tonally different villains back-to-back years, which is so interesting and bizarre to learn about. Everything about Dwayne LaFontaine really adds to the zany nature of Over the Hedge that really makes it a good film. I mean, without him, this film would actually be okay, but with him, he really makes this movie what it was when I was a child, being such a great experience. He's like Hades in the way that you really can't hate him, despite actually being a threat to the main characters because of how fun everything is around him and every single performance that is delivered in the most comedic way possible, with the most over-the-top performance I've ever seen. I mean, there's just so much to talk about him that makes him a great villain, but for the sake of my sanity and your time, I would just leave it here with the Verminator being the perfect villain who perfectly balances out the entire movie with the threat he poses and the fact he has the D-Pelter turbo that is illegal in every state except Texas, and the fact he gets his butt eaten by a dog at the end, which is sad to think about because all this time he was just doing his job, where for the sake of the movie's focus, he had to be defeated. Literally the best DreamWorks villain ever in my opinion, if I didn't know these others actually existed. To be honest, I really had a hard time with this pick, but I just value the other villains a lot more on this list despite Tai Long remaining to be the biggest threat that DreamWorks has ever produced. And once again, I've already covered him in my last video if you want to check out more of that, but I'll go through it again for the sake of it. Because Kung Fu Panda villains really represent the aspects of power very greatly, and Tai Long was actually the perfect to start off with a character being so good at Kung Fu like a protege. Just unfortunate for characters like Shifu cause he raised him and trained him to be the best, but how others like Oogway actually knew of the darkness inside him, how he didn't understand the true meaning of power like what Po had, knowing what it actually meant for all along. Just portrayed as a side more ignorant to the meaning of what the Dragon Scroll was trying to teach, and how Po understood more that as a character that grew throughout the film. It's just such a delight that impact the main characters in a special way about the wrong and right way to teach somebody about the lessons in power. And I wish I could rank him higher, but I just hold these favorites in a more higher regard as we will see. Lord Shen is truly the greatest Kung Fu Panda villain ever in my opinion that impacted Po in a different way, responsible for the deaths of his own family and the true threat above all DreamWorks villains for what he does. And once again, like Tai Long, this impact comes from his lust for power, though it is done in a more technological way rather than the plain old Kung Fu and physical way that he actually wants to get rid of, coming from a place that is lacking in love, thus being so focused on the material yet again. This is something I already touched in also if you want to watch that DreamWorks video, so I'll keep it brief once again because of how his actions alienated himself from his parents who actually loved him but just so blind to actually see the cost of his own lust for power. How we see this concept of the self-fulfilling prophecy actually executed so well because of the cost of these actions due to a person if left unchecked. One that actually affects the main character in a meaningful way, where we know how he actually ended up like this, that actually made Po appreciate the family he made along the way, where Shen just actually stopped caring about. It's amazing how he had all the opportunities to stop if he actually decided to actually look in front of them, but refused because of what he attached himself to in the material that led to his own demise in the end. In short, he's one of the scariest DreamWorks villains for what he did in the aspects of power that isn't delivered physically but rather mentally. Hal is just one of my personal favorite DreamWorks villains ever created for a story that really focused on its villains. It's an interesting take on what happens when power is given to the nice guy incel who is just a creep in it for the girl without any of the effort or means to be a hero. How Megamind really didn't understand what it meant to be because of what he was missing being the villain all his life, and finding a way to get it back so fast caught up with a dude who really didn't actually deserve to have that power to begin with. And that's something he admits himself when he gets those powers, and how we see him control those powers through his interaction with Roxanne Ritchie, being her cameraman at first and now having the power that most heroes have to swoon over the girl that he think he attained, where he realizes he can't because she doesn't actually like him this way, and knowing who he truly is as a person. One that actually turns him against being a hero because he actually doesn't understand that being in it for himself, and I really think that Jonah Hill did a good job in portraying that aspect. He just really thinks that having these powers is enough to attain everything he would in life, but just doesn't work knowing that our heroes act out of the selflessness of others rather than the selfishness of one's own desire. And this is something even he knows himself to a certain degree, where he admits to Roxanne that she sees in the good to others even when it's not there. How he admits that not everyone actually deserves to be saved based upon the delusions that don't really exist in other people. He's just a great contrast for Megamind to learn on his journey about being good and the perks that it has because of how he's worked so hard in his life to achieve his goals, while seeing that others in Hal just want to take the easy way out for what he experienced, getting to the end without being changed by the very journey in any way or wanted to be at all. It's really the best way to balance out what a supervillain actually should be in the most unlikely way possible, having a comedic low-life incel who doesn't achieve much in his life and does it in the most unlikable way possible. A guy who deserves his own video on why this actually should be as well. Let's be honest, there was no way I wasn't going to include Jack Horner high up on this list considering what he did to shape this very channel. He is just one of those villains being self-aware that he is a villain for the sake of villainy and power because everyone actually forgot about him and he wants to be powerful to all. Because we already know at this stage in his life he's attained so much that anyone would want to be successful on their own with a pie business, and how we learned he got obsessed with his fairy tale creatures and magic just like Farquaad and other shark villains that surpass their own. It's just a delight how he shows no remorse for killing his own men or just others in general so he can get what he wants in the most comedic way possible. Everything about him makes him stand out as the perfect villain because he fits the very definition of being one. One that I love to thank him and the YouTube algorithm for providing me to putting it on the map for talking about him. And his attitude and arrogance is very important in the journey of Puss's adventure with life and death chasing after him. One where I decided to exclude Goldilocks on this list because she is redeemed by the end, knowing her true family she learned from, one where she was actually more of a co-protagonist in her own right, and her adventure that just conflicted with Puss's Ramesses go for a singular wish that only one can make, and helping out when they finally found those aspects out about life, and how Jack Horner almost got his wish. One where we see because of his own arrogance and uncaring attitude of others taking delight in villainy, becomes the only real character to actually die by the end of the film because of this hubris. Just another great villain who didn't actually need too much and balanced out everything well in a film that got a lot right with so much going on. Now this is where I really had a hard time because of how great Death was as a villain, but one where I think you can understand, as we will see with the top 3, because he's probably one of the best, where I hold these villains in the most high esteem of all of DreamWorks history. For now, considering how much the Puss in Boots holds it that is perfect in villainy, Death really truly stands out on the top for being one of a force of nature portrayed in a physically threatening way that actually puts the fear into Puss for what is to come and what he wasted. That this entire journey happened based upon those facts that are truly enjoyable to see throughout his adventure, and the panic he goes throughout when he sees he faces his own mortality. It's really done well in this way that makes you feel you cannot stop him as a villain because of those certain aspects, that you cannot do anything no matter how hard you try to fight or whatever that you come into contact, because you know it's death itself, despite not being able to see that until the third act of the film, towards the end when he does realize it. That you probably somehow actually know within his first encounter where his life flashes before his eyes that it is death itself right in front of you, and how you actually certainly see that he feels that too. There's just so much about him that makes him stand out as a villain that is just one who's doing his job, being the physical and mental threat that he faces throughout the course of the film, and learning about the importance of life around you. The one where he actually makes him realize his mistakes and what he missed out due to his uncaring attitude. This is what we see at the end where he gets defeated, but one where we know he isn't truly defeated because he is death itself, fulfilling his job, just chasing a cat who wasted his 9 lives, but now seeing he understands the value of that very life and no longer fearing that aspect, allowing him to live as well until the very end where he could see him again. Just one of those villains that are portrayed well with who they are and what they're supposed to represent, and I applaud Puss in Boots for being the masterpiece and showing that value of life. This was another hard one to figure out, but considering villains and what they represent by definition, I think I was very justified to put Ramesses in second place also, because Ramesses is the most rich antagonist ever created to represent the pharaoh in the book of Exodus. It is just so rich and compelling that the Prince of Egypt is truly one of the greatest DreamWorks films ever, filled in the sea with boss babies and trolls. And yet again, he's another I've already talked about in extensive detail because of how rich he is as a character and as an antagonist to another level that affects the protagonist in a meaningful way, and Moses' story, considering that they were brothers who loved each other. His actions are done to fulfill his family's legacy and the pressures to hold up an empire, being berated as a weak link, and it shows. He's definitely not a villain in the traditional sense, but one who acts out of the weakness others actually sees in him, not acting out of complete disregard for others because he actually wants to, but because he has to. And we can see that when everything is taken away from him when his brother leaves and that he's bestowed with the power as pharaoh after his father passes, how he tries to uphold these responsibilities as a leader to the best of his abilities regardless of the consequences he carries around him. The burden of a legacy of horrors for the Hebrews, which he shows little care towards because he cannot let go of that very legacy, even if it costs his own people's lives, as we see when he allows his heart to get hardened. And once again, like I mentioned before, Rafe Fiennes does a fantastic job in portraying him and the conflict he has with Moses and setting his people free, constantly tossing with the idea of his family and brother, yet still confined and bitter to what he was deemed when he was younger. It's how something impacts you in a certain way that lives on for the rest of your life for better and worse, and how that results in your own destruction at the very end. He's just a man you actually want to root for, like how Moses actually wants him to change for the better, to see how much we wanted him to see that light that even I think God wants, but knows that he chose this path for himself of destruction, and how we know the story and how it's supposed to go because of how he decided that no matter what we think otherwise, how someone can do this because of the way they are and refuse to turn back otherwise, that seems weak to give up what they actually gained. How he rejects every path he has to turn against that when it seemed like he could because of what he knows what he had with his family. That he demonstrates he does care but chooses every opportunity to not do that costed him that in the end, losing his father, his son, and his brother, and how that actually stayed with him for the rest of his life. It's something we don't want to see, but has to happen in a world where God punishes those who does not fulfill his divine purpose, despite his many opportunities to have to be changed until their very last breath. All in all, he is the most complete DreamWorks antagonist ever, and quite possibly one of the greatest villains in all of cinematic history. And yep, the final one out of all of them has to be Fairy Godmother herself, the true perfect villain that DreamWorks has ever produced in trying to make the twist on the fairy tales in such unique ways, and really using harmless Fairy Godmother to be that villain is absolutely perfect in that aspect. She's truly the smartest and most manipulative one out of all of them, who gets what she wants every single time and displays this in so many ways that makes her effective to be that way. She often seeks to get the best for herself and her son Prince Charming rather than others, often resorting to blackmail and trickery through her magic to get her way. And what we saw through later in DreamWorks movies and Shrek villains, we can see how she truly set the standard in one of the greatest sequels that was ever made in all of cinema history. And I really love how she has this business selling potions that are mostly scams to get what she wants represented in a real way, compared to other shady business practices that most people actually give into quite easily into the tagline of happily ever after, except for ogres. The way she manipulates Shrek and Fiona is really effective, more so than you realize, and how she's able to convince both of them to equally different degrees. How she degrades Shrek at first for being an ogre whom everyone hates and gets no happy endings, to pretending to actually care for Fiona's best interests by having her son manipulate her into believing that he is the human version of Shrek, despite the clear differences she notices until she's supposed to drink the love potion she gave to Harold. How she's able to counter everything our heroes have to offer within a second until the very end, where I really love how Jennifer Saunders played that to perfection, to the acting, to the singing, and the comedy that is provided. She has no qualms about using her magic to get what she wants, and is spiteful toward those who interferes with their plans or business. The Fairy Godmother is just no fool. She uses any and every underhand trick that just makes her appear more benevolent and kinder than she really is. I just love how she pretends to be this kind and gentle at the beginning when the moment actually calls for it, but if there's any interference with that, she shows her true colors as a villain. She is just so ruthless and unreasonable, vengeful, evil, cruel, selfish, and will stop at nothing to remove those who stand in her way until the very end, when she's defeated when her spell is reflected by Harold, disappearing as tiny bubbles and gone for all of eternity. She is truly everything you want in a villain, and really did set the standard of modern villainy in all of its aspects that we know of today. The perfect one to close out this entire list as stands, where no one actually before could actually top her in personality, and no one after could actually stand above in villainy, thus concluding this on the highest of notes that held out for a hero until the very end. All in all, DreamWorks villains are mostly fun when they need them to be, but also very emotional when the moments actually call for it. And to this day, they manage to be the most interesting collection of stories for better and worse, and their villains really represent that and proves how much they can do in any style of film they actually choose to represent. From the compelling emotion of Ramesses to the comedic laughs of the Verminator, they are truly the bunch with the most variety to offer. And with that said, let's hope DreamWorks can still provide this variety for a long time coming, and I'm all done, so goodbye.